Okay. We decided it would be a nice way to celebrate EMBL at 50 years by having a series of events commemorating the different decades of EMBL. So in other words, we're going to survey over the course of the year memories of EMBL then and now, and to get an idea about where EMBL started from and understand better how it evolved and how that's affected the experience of people working at EMBL in different decades and in different capacities. So we're starting off today with EMBL theme from the 1970s and 1980s, and we've invited a series of guests to come along who all worked at EMBL in different capacities, whether as PhD students, postdocs, group leaders, laboratory heads, directors, and so forth. And we want to hear from everybody and to promote a fun period of reminiscing and remembering what EMBL was like back in the 70s and 80s. When, remember, it started off as the young kid on the block. It was a new startup laboratory, not so well known, but rapidly grew into its current role of being, I think many of us would feel, Europe's preeminent life sciences research institute. So to start with, I'm going to invite Karen Römisch, who is a pre-doc and EMBL Heidelberg from 1987 to 91 in Bernard Doberstein's group, to tell us three things about what she remembers about EMBL. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Angus. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me and thanks for listening. So my predominant memory of EMBL was that this was the first time where I actually had a real peer group. I was part of this very tightly knit group of pre-docs. We were 10 in my year. It was fabulous to be somewhere where for the first time you really were one of the crowd. They were all as mad as I was about science. We would do overnighters or gel running competitions or stuff like that. And this was totally different from my university experience, where I was always the odd one out because I wasn't interested in an overnight incubation. I wanted to know what's the minimum number of hours this has to go before I can move on. The other thing that really struck me about EMBL was the collaborative atmosphere. You could walk into any lab anytime, ask a question, ask for advice, ask for reagents, ask for help. Could be very extreme. Like I hung out a lot in Keith Stanley's lab at the time because my job in Bernhard's lab was to clone and sequence a gene in the beginning. And I had no clue how to do that. So I had a designated spot marked by Keith Stanley was taped on the floor next to his postdoc Karn's interview spot for Joachim. That was meant to be a joke. He didn't mind that I was there more time than in my own lab. And the third thing that really was amazing for me was the scientific opportunities were not curbed by money or technical problems or lack of personnel or anything. You could just do it. Whatever came to your mind, so long as it was vaguely sensible, you could just go ahead and do the experiment. With sometimes repercussions, like when Bernhard found out what the antigenic peptide costs that I used to raise 15 antibodies. But I could still do it. It was a fabulous time.
I can recognize a lot of those things you're saying, Karen, myself from my own experience when we overlapped during this period at EMBL. People, as I remember, also didn't think so much about money and didn't really mind which division or program people were working in. It was just more of a very integrated community where you knew everybody and would meet and interact and talk a lot. And then just have that spirit of saying, let's just try it out. So a lot of cross-fertilization at many levels.
Yes, indeed.
Did you find this spirit of EMBL was something you could take with you in the rest of your career?
I did in the way, I guess, in the way I chose to move on. So I was a postdoc in Randy Scheckman's lab afterwards, and that was very similar in many ways. And then it changed when I guess it changed as I progressed through my career because more of what I did was not science, but science administration or, things that you have to do, but don't particularly have a passion for. And I have to say I managed to maintain that spirit until I came to work at a German university. And that really is a totally different kettle of fish.
And do you feel that the European dimension or the international dimension, because it's not only European, obviously EMBL was much more than that. It was funded through Europe, but more broadly encompassed reminisced people from a much wider range of countries. Do you feel that added to your experience in the postdoc?
Oh, yeah, that was really good. And sometimes it was funny because it sometimes also emphasized prejudices that you didn't even know you had. But on the whole, it was a fabulous experience, particularly the various food groups that different countries brought to EMBL and the different types of celebrations. When we had the pre-chat, we talked about Burns Night, which was a total experience. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm proud to have been able to contribute a little bit with the other Scottish contingent members in EMBL to sharing a bit of our culture with the rest of the people there. And for me, that was also one of the highlights, was the diversity. I mean, that's become a very trendy term to use these days, but actually, I really think done properly is one of the greatest strengths for any society or organization, is to have real diversity, not to tick a box, but because it really deepens the experience.
Absolutely.
So Angus, I think we also have Graham Tabb that was a pre-doc and around the same time in the Matai group in genome biology. So maybe, Graham wants to add on the picture. I would be interested because I've been a pre-doc myself in the feeling about, the selection, the feeling about, the program in general. And also there was a lot of science, but I remember a lot of enjoyment. Maybe you guys can comment, or Graham can comment on that as well.
Sure, Thomas, I'll be happy to. So thanks very much for inviting me here, and I'm delighted to see so many old friends from my time at EMBL. It's lovely to see you all. And I was asked to say three things that I remember. Well, some of them are here on the screen in front of me, of course. I remember Angus. We overlapped quite a lot. I remember Karen. I remember Danielle. I remember Brian. I remember Roy. And if I scroll down the list and yeah, Daniel, I can see you now as well. And it's great that the EMBL community is still. Oh, and Matthias, sorry, now you're back again. I remember Matthias. I remember his day where he came to look at EMBL and we decided whether we wanted to hire him. And I think we all agree that we took a very wise decision then. So I've got lots of vivid memories for that time. I think what distinguished EMBL then from EMBL now was that it was incredibly small and intimate. It was true that everyone knew everyone else. I remember that at lunchtime we would simply go and grab our tray. The canteen was much smaller then. We would sit absolutely anywhere. We would chat to anyone who was around there. We would always talk about science. So there was a constant intermingling of groups and a huge number of interactions and synergies. And I have particularly fond memories of Leonard Phillipson, who would come down and sit and chat to us quite regularly. And I was as a humble PhD student, but even so, Leonard and I ended up working together, and I published a couple of papers together with Ian and with Leonard's group. So it was a very integrative atmosphere. Perhaps I should say that I was I think in the second year of PhD students at EMBL accepted, and I think there were only 6 of us in my year and 6 in the year above. So we really were a very, very tightly knit community. So the PhD students hung out together, but also we hung out together with sort of everyone else because there weren't enough of us to form our own network. And we all worked really hard, but of course we played hard as well. And I was in the containment, which for the newer people there might sound a bit peculiar, but the gene structure and regulation was in a separate building called the containment because it actually worked with gene technology, and this was held to be dangerous. So we were a sort of separate facility, and it was run by Riccardo Cortesi, who had understood that facilities in Heidelberg or at EMBL were much, much better than anything anyone could encounter in Italy. And every so often, everyone would decide, we have to eat. So we would go to one of their houses and have mass pasta evenings. We would also have weekly football meetings, Italy against the rest of the world. And I have very fond memories of a goal that Roberto, is he there today, scored against me, as I'm convinced was an accident, but he swears was intentional. So we worked really hard and we played really hard. And in summary, I think my 3 years at EMBL were the most intense and probably scientifically rewarding and definitely most enjoyable ones of my scientific life.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can definitely relate to that because I can attest that 10 years later, when I was in the PhD program, the football matches were still on and there was still an Italian versus rest of the world in Boxberg. I remember it was quite dreadful because I wasn't that good with football myself, and I was kind of fearing and trying to be up to the task with that. And Well, I mean, coming back to the science, the PhD program was a small PhD program back then. So, but the selection of the PhD program was, as far as I remember, a quite tough selection, and this was probably different from national PhD programs. Maybe, I don't know if Karin wants to pitch in on this.
Well, can I say it can't have been that tough, or I wouldn't have been accepted. But apart from that, let's pass it over to Karin.
I had the impression that when we went through the selection, some of it was still fairly experimental. You have to remember the PhD program was still relatively young. And so it was very different from any other selection process I've undergone in that it wasn't so important. We said this in the pre-chat as well. It didn't seem so important what you knew. It was more about could you make up a reasonable answer on the spot? Not as in invent something, but as in could you put things together and make sense out of them?
You know, I don't think I can sit and listen to Graham and Karin being so modest. As I mentioned earlier, I genuinely feel that the EMBL pre-doc program has been the jewel in the crown of EMBL. And I was always inspired by the quality and hard work and expertise and enthusiasm of the students. And if the program selected people who were passionate and able to think clearly and quickly, rather than simply people who could remember things they read in books, then I think that was a very good thing. Michael has his hand up. So
yeah, because I am one of the first group who started as a pre-doc in '83. That was the first group, and I forgot how many actually started, but I remember when we were interviewed at the end, every single applicant who was invited had to go in front of the committee, and people would ask, "What did they ask you?" And but there was a really very friendly atmosphere already, and we started out then together. And what you said earlier, I remember very, very well, very international. I ended up with David Meyer's group, who was similar to what Karin probably knows, Werner Doberstein. And David was actually the first director of the pre-doctoral program until he moved to Los Angeles. And I'm now, just in case you're interested, for 34 years, faculty at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So great to see a lot of faces and names from the old times.
Well, thank you for joining us, Michael. Graham has got his hand up, and then Ian is joining us too. I'm sure correct any comments that Graham makes, but Graham, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Angus. Hi, lovely to see you, Michael. It's been a long time. I wanted to say that the final stage of the interview in our case wasn't the panel session. We had that. We had the wandering around the groups, then we had the big panel interview, and then finally, in the evening I did, there was a big Bavarian party. Ian can remember this because he came up and tried to encourage me to work with him.
Ian, great to see you. Welcome, and please feel free to correct whatever it is Graham just said.
No, Graham was absolutely right. But there was the evening of the first selection, there was a Starkbier party. And it was exactly as Graham said. But the panel had a different function. The selection process was pretty relaxed, as people have said, the first few years. And when David took over, it began to become a bit more organized. But it was really Wieland who, I'm not sure what year Wieland started it, but it must have been something like 89 or 88, something like that. And Wieland really started to make things very organized and make everyone fed up, because he insisted that people were there for the selection. But Wieland put a huge amount of effort into making the PhD program something that was well organized, and in particular, making the selection process, which was something that was well organized. The first few years, there was, as people have implied, there was very little selection because there were very few applicants.
Yeah, I can certainly say, Ian, by the time I joined, I think the quality of students, however many were applying, was really excellent. And the number that have gone on to really be world leaders in research is a fantastic tribute, and to many other areas of science and administration and other aspects of society. I think it's a great tribute to what all the people who contributed to the program and who led the EMBL, of course yourself prominent amongst it, did over the years. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone. Richard, you're joining. Would you like to comment?
Yes, I was actually part of instrumentation as it was at the time, and I was selected to be on the interview panel for the very first postdoc selection. Now, I knew enough biochemistry, molecular biology at that stage to know what on earth I was selecting on. It was really, I didn't take the pace backwards soon enough. And basically, when it came to voting, I chose the people who were less boring and most confident. And it seemed a fairly fortunate selection, I think, because all those first group turned out to be really excellent, as I recall. So I can't remember whether I was ever invited again, but that first one was, I think, one where everybody was making it up as we went along.
Well, you obviously did a great job, so thank you very much with that. And I should also point out that we have this program at the Alumni Association. Thomas and I have at the moment been leading it to record interviews with alumni, including a number of prominent former PhD students, and these are available online for you to see. And more of these will be recorded in future. And we look forward to having as many of you here as possible agree to come and be interviewed and have your interviews made available to share with the community. So if you've enjoyed some of this discussion so far today, there's a long-form version of some of these discussions already available with selected people, including Graham Tebb. You can see it already on the alumni website, and there will be many more of them coming. So please do go and check them out. But while we have lauded quite correctly the excellence of the EMBL PhD students, of course, there were also outstanding postdocs as well. And we'd like to turn now to Daniela, who was one of the very early postdoctoral researchers at EMBL, and invite you, Daniela, to tell us about 3 things you best remember about coming to EMBL.
So, hello, everybody. I'm so excited to see so many friends still in the audience. It's really a pleasure for me. And I completely agree what I've been saying till now. I can add not very much, but something that was not mentioned was how EMBL was organized. So I was coming from Italy. When I arrived there, the lab life was very tough, but was easier compared to what we'll expect because we have everything prepared. There were women in the kitchen, prepare any type of solution you may need. There were people coming in the weekend preparing acrylamide gels that we could run in the week after. And also, I was astonished by the beauty and the organization of the Zylar Library. Coming from Italy, that when you need to find an article, I have to move physically from one institute to another university. And in Pisa, for instance, there is a Scuola Normale that has a quite famous library, but was not as the Zylar Library. To say something personal, I was one of the few Italians not being in the containment. And this was tough for us, as I want to tell people at that time there were still borders between European countries, and traveling was not so easy. So my English was very, very basic. And my worst period were the first days there because I managed to understand KIT, but then He was from Cambridge. Then I could not understand John Toos, that was from London, and not even John Dixon, that it was from the north part of England. But I survived thanks to the people around me, because everybody was very helpful. And I have to say that for each instrumentation, there was a person responsible. So whenever you want to use, for instance, a centrifuge, you were allowed to use it, but you have to spend at least 1 hour with John Grunberg speaking about all the different possibilities and all the possible errors you may encounter. And that was quite an experience.
Danielle, I'd also like to pay tribute to the Italian community at EMBL, who were in no small part responsible for me deciding to move to. There were two big things that persuaded me, actually three things that persuaded me to go. But when I first arrived to interview for a position as a group leader, 1986, I think it was, and I flew over from America for the interview and arrived on a Saturday evening, already maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, was dropped off by the taxi service at the main campus door, and Riccardo Cortese met me, and he was there, and he was in the lab with people, and we spoke for a few hours. And next thing I knew, I was invited to a party. That really made an impression, and I was so inspired by the passion of the many Italian people I met there, and really by the multinational environment that was there. So I think that's something perhaps other people might comment on as well. But for me, one of the things I feel so passionately about EMBL is as a cause for good is not only doing great science, not only teaching people how to do great science, but also providing a showcase of how to run international organizations bottom up in a way that showcases the best of international collaboration, regardless of backgrounds. And I also am very proud of the fact that EMBL didn't only accept people from the countries who funded EMBL, but from a much wider group. And I think that really went a long way to enrich the whole culture at EMBL. We are celebrating 20 years of EMBL in the 70s and 80s. And after 20 years, it was decided to hire someone to actually write a history of the first 20 years of the EMBL. And that person, some of you may remember, was David States. I had the privilege of doing an interview with David States, and he also came from the States, and he still lives in the United States. David had the challenge then of writing the history of the first 20 years. And there is an interview available that you can all watch on the Alumni website. But we wanted to play just a very short excerpt from that. David, it's great to see you again. I well remember you from my own time at EMBL. And I think you also have the honor of being EMBL's first official communications officer. Is that correct?
That's true. And there's a funny story behind that, because they weren't really even sure that that's what they wanted to do when they hired me. And when I was first hired, I was given 6-week contracts, and they would see if they still wanted to do it after that. And that went on for about 6 months before I got a full contract at EMBL. And then at that point really became the communications officer. I was really hired to write a history of the Institute for its 20th anniversary, the 20 Years On magazine that you well know.
That's right. I have a copy here, and I've been enjoying rereading it and seeing some of the photographs of colleagues looking much younger than they have been doing recently. So how did you first hear about EMBL, or how were you hired to do this job?
Hearing about EMBL and being hired were two different things. For writing the history was to create a positive image of the Institute, very much for the delegates that were on the council, because support for the Institute was not, I wouldn't say iffy, but you always had to cultivate that sense of the importance of the Institute. And the 20 Years On history really was to show and demonstrate to the council, as well as leaders, international leaders in the member countries, that this was a viable and important institute for the continent. I think I have to give credit to Fotis. I mean, it was really his vision to come in and do that. He hired me to do that. It wasn't that I walked into his office and said, you folks have to do this. It was his guiding principle. And And I have to say, there was some resistance at the beginning when I was hired to do this. One scientist actually point blank told me that we'd be better off not doing anything like this and keeping a very low profile, because if we keep a low profile, we'll keep being able to do what we're doing, which is just working out fine for us. I think it's important to understand that Fotis had come from Harvard and I was an American. And I think there was a little bit of concern about whether we were importing these sort of crass American policies for publicity and things like that. And it took actually doing the history and for people to see it when it was done to say, okay, this is okay. And this is something that we want. And my background wasn't biology, so I really had to learn a lot as I was going along. And I read a lot of people's who I was focusing on their scientific papers and things like that. Very intentionally, the human side of the story was melded with that, because I thought that's what made it interesting, is how these scientists went about making the discoveries they did. From my mind, making those stories viable meant that I may have written at a level that you wouldn't see in a scientific journal. But the scientists who did that work still had to respect what I was saying and says, okay, that's a simplification, but it's still accurate. Even before I came to EMBL, I had a mentor, Bruce Alberts. I don't know if you know.
Yes,
Bruce.
I do know Bruce.
He was my boss and at UCSF, and I had no idea who he was, but he inculcated the importance of basic science to me very early when I was really first joining the discipline. And I've been working for it's almost 40 years now that I statistically, you can demonstrate that basic science leads to more practical applications than the efforts that were immediately directed at trying to find some kind of quote unquote solution. I mean, it's just very clear. You can statistically demonstrate that. I come back to this idea of personalizing the science. I think you tell that story, but you make scientists human beings for the general public. My experience as having somebody who come from outside of science and then really learning about the community is a fundamental misunderstanding of what scientists do and how they think. I think that the general public thinks them as this sort of aloof, brainy people who don't understand the real world. And I think that's fundamentally false. The scientists, I know, certainly the good ones, you're going to run into eccentric characters all the time. But you do that anywhere in life. I think making the general public understand that scientists are not that different from the general public. They just look at the world in a certain way and they explore it in a certain way. And if you can express to the public why people are asking the questions they do and their curiosity, and then show what comes out of it, I think it really disarms this view of scientists as being this other kind of person. I think that's really, really important to turn scientists into human beings. I would like to say one last thing, and I think this is important because I think it's one of the reasons EMBL was founded, is I still have friends from that time that are all over the world. Most of my best friends in life are still from that time. And I come to Europe quite regularly to visit with them. And I think that was the lasting, for me, value, is meeting all these very, very bright people that have gone on to do really great things in the world.
I mean, I wanted to shift gear a little bit because, of course, here we have invited also former group leaders. And so here, for instance, we have Brigitte Jokusch, who was a group leader in the 80s in cell biology. So I would like to bring her in and hear about what are the things that she remembered about the EMBL back then.
So hello, everybody. So far, I must tell you that I probably don't know any of the people who talked so far, because I was there earlier than most of you came to the EMBL. I was there already in 1978 to 1981. And at that time, EMBL was hardly known to the scientific community in Europe and in the States. I came from Basel at that time already there. I was a group leader at the Biocenter. I was working on muscle and muscle proteins in cells because I was a cell biologist. And I wanted to have a position in Heidelberg because my husband just got a position at the University of Heidelberg as a professor. And we had a family to bring to Heidelberg. So I talked a little bit around, and then I found that there was this newly founded laboratory. Not all of the labs were already in order and could be used. But I went up there to Sir John Kendrew, who had given me a small slot of an audience, and I spoke to him. We could talk about muscle because he came from Cambridge as a muscle man with his myoglobin structure. And he seemed to be quite interested. And he looked at me, and I left a lot of publications there. And then he said, come back tomorrow. And I walked up there to the Saupferch-Eckfahrt at that time. That was the address of the EMBL in earlier times. And he said, look, I shall offer you a position as a group leader for one condition. We have to teach you some proper English here. Because I came with quite an American slang from the Midwest, where I had spent 3 years earlier working at McArdle. So that was my introduction to EMBL. And I think listening to what you already discussed here, I think the position of newly employed group leaders there was quite different. You have to remember that all of us were quite old compared to the pre-docs and postdocs that were employed later there in the program. We had no program. It was completely to the director, Sir John, what he thought would be available for positions of group leaders. And how could he trust us to form a group for the future of EMBL? So at that time when I came, there was a number of group leaders, men, and there were 3 women who got employed for group leaders. The late Chika Shala, she was interested in identifying the head activator as a differentiation marker, a quite ambitious project. Then there was Christiane Nüsslein-Vollhardt and myself. The 3 of us knew each other from earlier times. We all had been working in Tübingen at the Max Planck Institute. Christiane, like me, had come from Basel, from the Biocenter. And so there were these 3 German females. They knew each other, but they didn't work together. And for almost 4 years, I was there at EMBL. I think I met Janni maybe 3 or 4 times. There was no communication, which was very important for the 3 of us. And the thing was that I also was a little bit outside of everything because I was the only group leader who had small children to look after. And listening to your conversation in the last minutes just brought me back one of my problems at EMBL. Most people there, also in the earlier times when I was there, were interested in sharing their good scientific results, the good atmosphere of EMBL, with experiences in late night events, in alcohol, in positions, and in conversations between each other. For me, my life started at 7 o'clock in the morning when I got my kids to the kindergarten in Neckargemünd. Then I ran an old VW Volkswagen up to EMBL, tried to work. And then at around 10:30, the person arrived there whom I shared my lab with. That was Graham Warren, an excellent scientist, but he was interested in membranes and in biochemical events from the Golgi to the membranes. He got in contact with a group of Kai Simons, but I had very little things to share with him. He came in at 10:30 and he wanted to talk. He left the lab at maybe midnight, but I had to go home at around 6 o'clock to see my children. So I never got into the inner circle where people in the big groups there, like cell biology, experimentation, genetics, would talk about the development of EMBL in an excellent institution. And I felt a little bit aside. I would not have dreamt of asking for help with my children. There was no kindergarten, no nothing. I wasn't even asked for my family or whether I had children or not. It was my private thing. And I thought that was all right. These were the times. These were the times.
I should say that this is a very important point, because then we know that the EMBL equipped itself with a kindergarten, but these were the days in which none of it was there. I think then the focus on families as EMBL grew and got bigger became very important. Graham, I see, has his hand up, and maybe he wants to comment on a bit of this.
Brigitte, I was really sorry to hear your experience, because the isolation is very different from what we experienced a few years later. But I'd like to comment a little bit on the children, the childcare facilities, because they were a big problem when I started at the EMBL, and we actually had a pre-doctoral student, a French girl whose name escapes me, who had a child. For reasons that I can't remember, and if I could, I wouldn't tell you, I ended up as, first of all, pre-doctoral representative on the staff council, and then bizarrely enough, as president. And in my year of presidentship, I had the important task of persuading EMBL and EMBO to establish a kindergarten. And I remember finally, after numerous meetings with Konrad Müller, who was never very keen on the idea, but supported it enormously, and with John Toos, who was much harder to persuade, that we finally achieved the agreement that if we could have a certain number of children, I believe it was 10, registered by a particular date, we could open it. And as the day approached, we came up, but on the very final day, we were one child short. So Thomas Graf and Patricia Kahn said that they would register a child that didn't actually exist, simply to make up the numbers, which they very, very generously did. This non-existent child was added to the list. We had the 10 or 8 or whatever we needed, and the kindergarten opened. And from then on, I think it took off enormously, and there were far more children within a few years. But without John's willingness to give it a go, and Patricia and Thomas's generosity in registering a child that they hadn't actually had yet, I think none of it would have been possible. So I'd like to thank all of them. And I think EMBL is now incredibly well equipped with excellent child facilities, but it goes back to John, Thomas and Patricia in the late 80s.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not accusing anybody of this. It was just the times. And I just hadn't the very idea to tell people about my problem. It was my private life. It was my situation. And I chose to have children, and that was the times. And it wasn't that I was completely alone. Let me just mention that the number of people who I could talk to about my private life, but also about science. Among all, there was Mary Holmes in the library, who was an extremely important point for me, where I could get away from all the hassle, which also at that time existed in some groups of EMBL. But I never met, as I already mentioned, for example, Christiane Nüsslein-Vollrath, who is a good friend of mine today, but that came up much, much later than EMBL. At that time, she was in her little office and had very little contact to the other group leaders. I also had very good contact to Jacques Duboucher. So today I can look at my time at EMBL, the time where I had contact to very good very good persons who actually then made the best of EMBL, in that they got the Nobel Prize because of their work and research during EMBL. When I left EMBL, I did so because my husband got a position at the newly founded university in Heidelberg, in Bielefeld, and I moved there and stepped about 2 positions down from what I had in the EMBL. That was a very hard time. But still, later than that, it was good that I could state, yes, I was accepted at EMBL. I had a number of very good publications there, but my major work was not rooted in EMBL. At that time, as a group leader, I already had people from outside. I was involved in many networks. I had a couple coming from the States, They did a sabbatical with me on EMBL. I had my own money because I could employ a technician for myself at EMBL. So I felt all right research-wise, but EMBL for me was not the only home base for my former career, for my later career. Sorry, this is just, I just mentioned this because I think not everybody was in the same boat, right?
Yeah, no, but this is a great story. And, it gave us the chance to also talk about the start of the kindergarten, which I think has been a great invention. And also to talk a bit of Mary, who has been great for many people at the EMBL. And we have an interview of her that goes over the initial days of the EMBL.
Just listening to Brigitta's story, one other thing it reminded me of from my own experiences at the time. So I have 3 children who were all born during my time in Heidelberg. They were all born not in Heidelberg city, but just outside in the small town of Wiesenbach, where I lived. And one of the things I vividly remember of many interactions where the people who did have children, my experience, at least, Brigitta, was we also had a different sort of social life where I was not going out after my children arrived late at night partying, but we had a lot of events that were shared with other people who had small children. And one of the fun things I remember was in the multinational environment, all the adults, when we would get together for a barbecue or a party, the adults would all speak English to each other because that was the only language everybody understood. The children would all speak German to each other because they all grew up and went to the kindergarten. And then you had this remarkable series of binary interactions between parents and children where you heard everything from Persian to Italian to Spanish to Russian or whatever between parents and children. It was a very fun and unique experience for me on the family side. But one of the other group leaders who I have to say I especially remember from that time and who played one of the biggest influences on my own career, and so I'm very honored that he's agreed to come and speak with us today, is of course Brian Sproat, who's here with us. Brian, you were my biggest influence and major collaborator at the time, and I wonder if you could just share with us 3 things you remember about your time as a group leader at EMBL.
Okay, fine. Thanks very much, everyone. Yeah, so I was a bit of an oddball when I arrived at the EMBL because I'm trained as a synthetic organic chemist. That's what I did in the University of Oxford. I spent 1981 till 84 at the MRC lab in Cambridge, where I started playing around making oligonucleotides. Little did I know that would dominate my entire career, almost still till today. And I thank Sydney Brenner for pushing me in the direction of the EMBL. So I ended up applying for a job, getting it. I was very surprised. There were very good candidates. I think 32 applicants I interviewed, and I went through the pile. Ended up in the biochemical instrumentation program. And the first thing I noticed, I think, at the EMBL was the incredible infrastructure that was available. And that meant from the mechanical workshop, electronic workshop, drawing office, everything, all the infrastructure, canteen, everything, coffee room. In fact, that coffee room turned out to be a place where Angus and I and a few other colleagues at the EMBL spent a lot of our hours discussing innovative science and trying to find ways of using organic chemistry, particularly oligonucleotide chemistry, to help molecular biologists and structural biologists. So my role was basically to set up a group and eventually run a complete oligonucleotide synthesis facility, which basically supplied the outstations as well. So I had interactions with pretty well everybody in the EMBL at some point or other, either in my office or in the coffee room. And so this is, I think, very important. And then it's 10 years I spent there from 1984 till 1994, I think for sure was the best 10 years of my scientific career. We published a lot together. We patented things, wrote book chapters. It was fun. And we also had a good time as well. So, and helping the library with Mary, that was also very, very important for me as well. You couldn't get access, and I sometimes had to go downtown to the institute where Ken Holmes was to get some articles. So I think for me, it's the story is about you could do anything at the EMBL. There was a big pile of cash, almost bottomless. You could get everything you needed. I ran a key service, so I usually got what I wanted, and also sat on the purchase committee, which was very convenient. So played by the rules, of course. And I think this important thing about then the innovation, which led to developing new nucleotide analogues, which ended up nowadays in antisense compounds, which have developed into key therapeutic modalities nowadays, but also in the construction of instruments. And I was involved intimately with the development of one of the first non-radioactive DNA sequences on the planet, and that was developed in Ansorger's group. But I think most of all, also that the innovation that we developed was applied everywhere. We made compounds for people outside the EMBL. With the results Angus had in the splicing work, we decided to make compounds. We supplied other labs. I taught on several EMBO courses to show how these things can be applied in general science. And I think for me, it was a great place to work hard and play hard. We used to play snooker. I used to play tennis. In between, go for a pint down the road. Had some amusing experiences one day up the car park because we had a very heavy rain shower and it froze solid. I tried to get to my car. I don't know how many times I fell over in the car park and decided, okay, everybody, we go back, stay indoors for several hours till it thawed, because basically the car was covered in a sheet of ice. So it was very, very amusing, and everybody was, joking and whatever. So yeah, and of course Leonard Phillips, and I remember very well. He was very important, and he was always available. You could drop in his office. You could meet him at lunch, where you have to find which table he was on, because he was everywhere. He was involved in everything. And he encouraged Angus and I to look at ribozymes one day, and it's something we did very successfully. He was always supportive. And these are very fond moments I think back on. That's a bit of my story in a nutshell.
No, I think that resonates with many people here, Brian. It's great to hear you recount it, and I think you've just summarized what for me was very much the spirit of EMBL, that we were all in it together. Yep. It was something where we could sit, we could talk about ideas. The program structure was very porous, so it didn't matter. We were in different departments. We would cross that, and if we had an idea for something, you could just try it. You could just go and try it without having to write grants. So the administration was very uncomplicated, and this was a very fertile environment for cross-fertilization between different subject areas and disciplines, and it stimulated a lot of us scientifically, I think, a great deal. So we've been hearing about people from all these different levels of operating in EMBL, but of course some people have to be in charge. And I think, Thomas, you're going to speak now, someone who can give a perspective from higher up.
I think we are climbing up the ladder, and we come to program director, head of outstation. And in fact, we have here Heinrich Sturman, who was the first head of the EMBL Hamburg from 76 to 81. And those were the days, because the EMBL was starting, and certainly Hamburg was a very important enterprise to even have the EMBL set up in Heidelberg. So maybe Heinrich can tell us about those days. Hi, Henrik.
Well, I have prepared something. What did I learn at the MBA?
Yeah.
Well, the occasionally complicated life at the MBA made me strong enough to accept new challenges during my long lifetime I was given. I did not understand immediately after my departure from the MBA, but my future steps into new areas of research would not have been successful without the experience with the MBA. In fact, the MBA gave me more than I ever could have given back in return. That was the end of what I have been preparing. Thus, you have now, let's say, a rough idea about my feeling of the MBL, which is mixed, let's say it like that. Let's start with the beginning. You all know that in 1975, the agreement to set up the EMBL outstation was signed, and 1 year later, Sir John Kendrew offered me, quite to my surprise, position as the head of the outstation of Hamburg, and starting 1st of September. Our family, my wife, and our 4 children moved to Hamburg at the end of summer holidays and away from the mild climate at Mainz to the fresh breeze from the North Sea. My family enjoyed it. We had no problems with the children, let's say, what to do with them, because my wife, as a Belgian lawyer, was not welcome in Germany, not at all, because she couldn't find a job because she was Belgian, and the Belgian law doesn't apply here. Thus, she stayed at home and she was taking care of 4 children. Ken Holmes introduced me to the staff of EMBL, which was already there. And he showed me the empty bunker 4 with a closed beamline of impressive width through which the synchronization from the storage ring doors was expected to enter the hall. My task, different from what you have heard before from other, is to add instruments using the radiation for various applications. A huge challenge, quite different from what I was used to as a professor at my home university, you can imagine. With the large horizontal width of the beam entering the hole, 5 beam lines could be accommodated, focusing optics of the type Huxley-Holmes on the ground floor, one for protein crystallography, another one for small angle diffraction. 2 double monochromator systems in the vertical plane, one for anomalous small angle scattering, which I like very much, and the other one for the most power scattering, organized by the people from Munich. The direct center beam was served for different purposes, among them also by Huxley, but finally for exarchs. We were parasitic users of synchrotron radiation. That's the problem. Much enthusiasm was needed to support the long waiting times for the arrival of the beam. However, the excellent communication with the DAISY staff operating the storage ring was very helpful. The performance of the instruments significantly improved. The results became more impressive with the time. And in 1979, we had even a few months of main user time at Torres. This considerably boosted the quality of our experiments, a glimpse of a future paradigm for which we had waited a long time. Well, thus I'm coming to an end, but the end you have already heard. And I would leave it to you. What would you like to know from me, really? Because the life in Hamburg has many facets, quite different from what you usually have heard so far, but extremely interesting. I must say I learned a lot of things at the EMBL I had never dreamed of before, which was sometimes, let's say, a special experience, but as I told you, it has been very useful. It was an essential step, the first step to what I was doing later on, which is quite different from what we have been hearing so far.
No, but I think, Eric, this was very, very interesting because we know that the large infrastructure from physics was really instrumental to convince the country to finance EMBL. There was this idea that you needed large infrastructure, especially for structural biology. So I think it's very fascinating to having heard from you the beginning of EMBL Hamburg. And I realized that it must have been very different from your experience, from the experience of the EMBL Heidelberg. It was a different enterprise, building a beamline from zero in the bunker, right?
Yeah, and I think given the emphasis of EMBL on structural biology and the interest in structural biology of Sir John Kendrew as the first director, obviously the laboratories in Hamburg and in Grenoble played a huge role in the success of EMBL, and we're very pleased that we also have Andrew Miller here with us. Hi, Andrew, who was involved in running the EMBL laboratories in Grenoble, and it would be great, Andrew, if you could share some of your memories and thoughts about the early days of EMBL and about your experiences in Grenoble.
We came to Grenoble in 1975. We were shown into the laboratory because the idea was EMBL would be set up to develop the applications to biology of neutron scattering. And John Kendrew was the name that I really should mention because he was a great Director General. When I was in Grenoble, he would just send a telephone call that said, come and meet tomorrow to Heidelberg, where where I will be. I've got some questions. Bring some questions with you. So I would go. He asked me, he told me what he wanted to know, asked me what I wanted to know. We had lunch together. I went back home, and then I'd get a letter from him saying directly what we had decided. And, I'd asked for certain finances to support things. If he had said yes, it happened. He was really an excellent person to work with. I think also, if you go to the point that Angus has just made, he was, of course, a structural chemist. I mean, he looked at the shapes of molecules, and so was I. We got on very well. There's a photograph of the staff at EMBL in the office in Heidelberg. I think it was really an important thing to bear in mind is this. Up until now, speakers that we've heard today have been all biochemists, chemists, geneticists, these people. But what the Grenoble outstation did was first to really develop neutron scattering, a huge physical thing coming from a large nuclear reactor. And then several years later, the synchrotron, the European synchrotron, was developed from 1986. And EMBL, again, very important in giving facilities to the biologists, good biological facilities, good biochemical facilities in EMBL, and then the visitors could come, prepare their material, and then go through a little gate in the fence that was between us and the reactor. So I think EMBL, you've all emphasized strongly the biology, the genetics, and all that, these wonderful things that you did. But it was important that EMBL also recognized that physical sciences were essential. That whether it was neutrons or X-rays, but EMBL was a very important force in developing both of these. So I think that really we difficult to say quickly how EMBL affected us. It affected my family, affected other people who came from different countries very, very deeply indeed. As a family, we just love France now. We had some adventures coming at the beginning when the children could speak French very well, and the adults, myself and my wife, didn't speak quite so well. When we went into a shop, the children always said, "Now, Mum and Dad, don't you speak, we'll speak," because they could speak French, and we had to stand and just did what was asked. It was a great time, these 5 years. I then came back to another 5 years for the synchrotron, and EMBL outstation is absolutely great. I should also say that Stephen Cusack, who took over eventually of the Grenoble outstation, has brought it to a very high level, indeed, scientifically. I'm really delighted the way that he's developed it.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that. It's been great today to hear about experiences of people in the first 2 decades at many different levels, and about how the environment and the opportunities, the infrastructure contributed to our ability to do science. But of course, none of us could do science if we weren't supported by the fantastic administration and also by the logistics. And I think, we're also very keen in the Alumni Association to capture that. And I encourage people to listen to the interviews we've already recorded with Mary, for example, from the first set up the EMBL library, and also people from the workshop. And I thought it would be really nice to have a word this afternoon also with Ingo. Again, some of my early memories and lasting memories about my time at EMBL was being able to go to the stores and get absolutely anything we needed. And I've never had an experience like that again in my life. Ingo, I wonder if you could share just a few thoughts about your own experience working and having to deal with these damned frustrating scientists who kept coming and wanting you to give them everything.
Well, it was a great experience for myself, I must say. And I enjoyed, as any speaker before me said, that it was a great time in my life. These 9 years at EMBL, and I started off in the stores and there, and then it was very interesting to unpack all these weird chemicals, and some came in dry ice, and some just in wet ice, and some none, and so that was very interesting, I must say, and also meeting all these, as you say, crazy scientists from all the various countries was also very interesting for us, and we always had a good laugh. And if I may tell a little story, probably you remember Ross Steller. He came in, and we unfortunately stored something in -20, which should have been in -70, and explained to us that, well, there could be some reactions, taking place in -20 already. And then I said, well, and for myself, I can say -20, there are not many reactions happening. And he laughed and left, and then he just a second later he came back and said, well, I must say sometimes at room temperature I have no reactions as well. So that was just an example of sometimes having a good laugh. So yes, it was a good time, and I moved on then to the finance section, and maybe you remember these orange stickers on all the machinery we had, and working together as a successor of Torben Paulsen. You probably remember.
I remember Torben, yeah. Yeah,
of the early days. And yes, it was a great time, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a word.
No, thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I say I mentioned earlier briefly about how the environment with the enthusiastic and effervescent Italian community really inspired me to want to come to work at EMBL. But one of the other things that finally decided me to come to EMBL, some of you maybe have heard me tell this story before, was I had to decide when I was working in the US with Phil Sharp at MIT, whether I would go back to the UK to carry on my career or come to Heidelberg instead. And in the end, one of the problems I had, which was not directly connected with my science, is I had a cat that was very precious to me. And if I went back to the UK, it would have to go into quarantine for 6 months. So Lennart Philipson said, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. And he made sure that all the paperwork and administration was done so I could bring my cat unquarantined into Germany. And as soon as he promised he would do that, that was it. It was a done deal. I turned down ICRF and Mill Hill in London and took the job in Heidelberg. So I think having a flexible administration, Matthias, I think is whether you see it was a good thing or a bad thing that they got me to come to EMBL, I think there are definite advantages of that. I hope that's still true today.
That's a trick question, is it? I think many things that we discuss now have, of course, changed because times have changed. I think that this collegial helpfulness, etc., that has not changed. I would think drinking, definitely fewer people who would engage in this. The drive towards political correctness, I think, has definitely gone through society and also reached EMBL. And of course, administration. There have been more demands, I guess, put on administration for documentation, etc., etc., and that has removed some of the extremely helpful informality that I also have enjoyed very, very much. There's the question, of course, whether there could be a happier medium. I personally seem to believe that that could be strived for, and we can learn also things from remembering the times that we discussed. Maybe get the 2020s version of some of the things that were mentioned as values and points of joy from the 70s and 80s. I believe that could be done. I hope that there were other members than just I who kind of listened to this conversation and maybe took learning lessons from it.
Yeah, I think you just made some really great points, Matthias, that of course it's right and proper that EMBL has to evolve. I mean, I guess it evolved in several ways. For one thing, it became, if not exponentially, at least a hell of a lot bigger than it used to be. And so it's just not physically possible to recognize and know personally every person. I'm sure you could comment on this, or I don't know if Ian is still available, but when we were saying, so John Kendrew or Leonard Phillipson could have lunch every day with the people. It's probably too big for that to be realistic. So size matters and has some effect, but also society has changed. It has evolved, and there are definite things. I mean, I think it was very good to hear from Brigitte about some of the challenges she had as a young mother with children, and I think raising more awareness of some of these issues is definitely a good thing. The only point I would make, I'd open it up for comments. I really love to hear Ian's view as well, is that even if we decide today that it's right and proper that EMBL does some things differently to the way we did it 30, 40 years ago, I really don't think we should forget or censor the way it was done before, because it was of its time, and I think it's important to remember things as they were, and you can still enjoy them even if we reflect and say, well, we wouldn't do it that way today. That's how I would see things. Ian, would you like to?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that many of the things that are no longer possible, that were easy to do in EMBL in the 1980s, are things that are much better not done. So I think it's absolutely sensible that the organization evolved. I think what is potentially achievable, and I think what Matthias was referring to, I think is maintaining the maximum flexibility. And I think that's something which takes a lot of work and constant work, and is obviously, as you implied, much more difficult when you have 2,000 people than when you have 400. And so I think it's striving to maintain the flexibility and the informality of interactions is really worth fighting for.
I think if I could leave one last comment, a motto for doing science that I developed during my time in Heidelberg at EMBL with you, that I've tried to keep with me throughout, is that science should be fun. It can be hard work, it can be challenging, strenuous, stressful, but it should also be fun, right? And I hope that regardless of whatever restrictions or changes society and modern requirements put in place, I really hope you don't lose sight of that concept, that we should really still enjoy it and be able to enjoy it.
Yeah, maybe if listening to all that we have listened today, one common point that comes up is that EMBL really changed the life of many people in many different ways, but still for the positive, not only for the science. And I'm sure that in the next few encounters that we will have, this will be a constant concept that will keep on coming up.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Thomas. And I'm really looking forward to hearing which things are held in common as people reflect on their own experiences then and now. Once again, time has got the better of us. I'm really grateful for everyone who's joined us. I highly recommend you to check out the long-form interviews that we're putting online. I hope many of you will be able to participate in this celebration of 50 years in July, whether online or in person. If you're there in person, I look forward to speaking with you, and I look forward to seeing you at future coffees with EMBL. So thank you again. Bye.